Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and today we are doing a deep dive into a topic that I find fascinating. And it's been weighing on my mind ever since my classes last week. Before I get to everything, make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with others. We have to inform them on the real issues that are detrimental to our society because we are losing our national identity. And today I want to focus on misplaced priorities and forgotten values that are plaguing our nation. As Americans, we pride ourselves on certain core principles. I constantly talk about the idea of limited government, concepts like liberty and freedom, but it's become increasingly clear that we've lost sight of what those principles actually mean, and more importantly, why they're so important. Sure, we may say the words, we may say and fool ourselves into believing that we believe in these principles, but do we really have a grasp on how important these principles are, and how much are we responsible for the current failures? How much are we responsible for the erosion of core principles that have shaped this nation? Now, today we're going to explore why these values have fallen by the wayside and what we could do to reclaim them. We're going to take a look at the state of our government, the erosion of liberties, the ever-encroaching specter of government overreach. But before we could dive into that, let's take a moment and let's remind ourselves what these values actually mean. So if we take limited government, what does limited government really mean? And it's a concept that the Founding Fathers believed in. They enshrined it in our Constitution to safeguard us against tyranny. But somewhere along the line, we seem to have forgotten that the purpose of government is not to micromanage every aspect of our lives, but rather to protect our freedoms, protect our rights, our liberties. In recent years, though, we've been willing to give up our liberties. just look at coronavirus. I'm going to get into that because I had a fascinating conversation with my students last week. But in recent years, we've seen an alarming expansion of government power with bureaucrats and politicians thinking that they could do whatever the hell they want, that the Constitution is nothing more than an inconvenience, a roadblock. As I always say, they've forgotten what public service actually means. It used to mean to serve the public. Now, according to the bureaucrats in power, it's to rule over the public. And they believe that they get to control how we think, what we could see, what we could hear, what we could watch. It really is stunning how far government has expanded. Then there's the idea of liberty, the bedrock upon which our nation was founded. It's a word that has been tossed around so much that people don't even know what it means. But at its core, liberty is about the freedom to live our lives as we see fit, without any fear of undue interference from the state. In its purest form, it's the natural condition of human beings where we get to exercise our free will responsibly in accord with the dictates of right reason and natural law. But all too often, we find our liberties under assault, whether it's through regulations, surveillance, censorship. However, the worst part about it all, a lot of the times it comes at the invitation of the people, where we consistently demand more government intervention throughout our society to solve problems that either the government itself created or problems that the government does not have the ability to solve. And yet we keep on empowering them. Like if the government just did nothing in regard to a problem, would the problem actually worsen? A lot of times the answer is no. Let's just be honest. You have governments that can't even fix potholes right. We're supposed to pretend that they could solve the complex issues that society faces, that our communities face? It's preposterous. We spend over $1 trillion on the education system, over $1 trillion. You would think that we were producing a bunch of little Einsteins, but we're not. I've explained how our education system has collapsed, proficiency levels are at all-time lows, many students don't know anything. I've explained it all, time and time again. Yet what do? Well, we keep the monster going, we keep the beast going. Oh, it needs more funding, that's the problem. No, it doesn't need more funding. It needs competency, that's what it needs. We have to reevaluate the whole system. When it comes to the bureaucracy, when it comes to government, the three problems are the 3 E's: equality, efficiency, and effectiveness. When you look at it, the 3 E's are non-existent, particularly efficiency and effectiveness. How often do we review failed government programs to see if they're actually achieving their goals and objectives? How often do we review these programs to see if they're operating in an efficient manner? And then you look at the concept of freedom, the principle that underpins everything else. It's what allows us to pursue our own happiness, speak our minds, chart our own course in life. It's the ability to exercise our liberties without the interference of an all-powerful, abusive government. But as our society becomes increasingly polarized and authoritarian, we find that freedoms have been curtailed in the name of safety, in the name of security, or the amorphous idea of social justice. So where do we go from here? How do we reclaim these values that are integral to the American identity? And I decided to do this topic because it has become increasingly clear we are lost. We deviated far from the original intent of the Founding Fathers, and nowhere is this more evident than the raging debate over TikTok and the $1.2 trillion spending package that was just pushed through. The misplaced priorities amplify why we're in this position in the first place. And I'm going to explain it all, but first we have to take a quick break. When we come back, I will dive right in, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, I explained that we are lost as a civilization. We're lost as a society, that we've deviated far from the original intent of the Founding Fathers. And as a professor of political science for nearly 20 years, it was certainly one of the more interesting weeks in my classroom. And the topic of the day was the looming threat of a TikTok ban. You know, on March 13th, the House passed a bill that would lead to a ban on this app. And listen, there are good arguments on both sides, okay? There are good arguments to say that this is government overreach, it's abusive. There are good arguments to say TikTok is a national security risk because it's controlled by China. However, I was more interested in getting my students' thoughts because this bill now moves to the Senate. It faces an uncertain fate. And I knew that this topic would spark debate amongst my students, especially given that they are the demographic whose lives revolve around the app. Now, when I asked students how many use TikTok, nearly 90% of their hands were up. Students who had been silent throughout the entire semester so far, they sprang to life. It was like a bolt of lightning hit them, and they wouldn't stop talking. They were offering their thoughts on the subject, and some were arguing that it's unconstitutional. Others said that it was a form of censorship and an attack on free speech. There were some that believed that a ban is necessary. And my students are hardly alone. We're seeing this debate evolve throughout the country. There has been massive mobilization of young people to thwart the passage of the bill. You even had a House GOP staffer say that it got so bad, their phone lines haven't stopped ringing, and they were so inundated with calls that they had to shut the phone lines down because they were being so bombarded. Now, as my students were providing their opinions, I wondered, they're coming to life, they're talking. Why is it that a generation so quick to oppose the potential loss of an app remains frighteningly silent in the face of being stripped of their most fundamental freedoms? It's become clear that we live in America where the threat of losing access to an app like TikTok incites greater outrage than the government's encroachment upon the most basic liberties. And I drew attention to the contrast between the fervent response to a potential TikTok ban and the relative silence regarding the all-too-real government overreach that we witnessed throughout the pandemic, where nearly 2 years of these students' lives were stolen from them, were robbed from them. During the pandemic, there was little outrage from this cohort. When you look at any society, it's usually, the 15 to 25-year-olds that are fight the system, that push back, that speak up, that protest. But there were no mass demonstrations. Few of them contacted Congress or the state legislative bodies to complain about the authoritarian decrees where they were socially isolated. They were prevented from attending school in some cases for nearly up to 2 years. They had to wear these restrictive face masks. There was no concerted effort to address the loss of their liberties as their youth was being robbed from them. And I asked my students, I asked them a bunch of questions. Why? Why is there a greater willingness to advocate for TikTok compared to protesting the government trampling on their liberties? In all my classes, not a single student provided me with a satisfactory response. Not a single one. Some said it was a pandemic. It's different. The government was trying to protect us. And others said that it was an unfair comparison, and they're right. It is an unfair comparison. It's apples to oranges. The government's actions during the coronavirus pandemic, compelling students to sacrifice significant milestones in their lives, prolonging periods of school closures, like I said, up to 2 years in some cases, determining when, where, and how they could exercise their faith, determining who could come into their homes, who they could hang out with, forcing social isolation upon them. Yeah, that's far more dangerous than the potential loss of a controversial social media platform. Far more dangerous. And I want to make it clear, anytime the government's getting involved to ban something is a cause of concern for me, particularly in this bill if you actually read the bill. Because while the bill does label TikTok, it gives enormous power to the executive branch, the president, to deem any app as a national security threat. Anytime there's any type of foreign interference. So if they ban TikTok, how long will it be before they try to ban X because Elon Musk, because they despise him and they have now labeled him as a right-wing loon? So how long it will take before they get to that level, especially when we look at the upcoming election? I'm not for the ban. I don't support the ban. However, I wanted to play devil's advocate with my students because I really wanted to push them. It has been so frustrating watching what has taken place, how they've been harmed over the last several years, and how they just don't care. But the entire debate reflects the failures of our educational institutions. These institutions place greater emphasis on social justice propaganda rather than grounding students with a deep understanding and appreciation of individual liberties, limited government, the Constitution, civic responsibility. Many of my students actually said they had no clue. They were completely unaware that they could contact members of Congress prior to getting to my class. They had no idea that you could do that. And it is an indictment of our education system that these students learned more about civic engagement in 1 week from TikTok than they did over the span of 13 years within the education system, at least 13 years. And this is the problem. People don't know how to think critically anymore. They don't understand what civic responsibility is. And they certainly don't have an appreciation for individual liberties. If we did, the government wouldn't have dared to do the authoritarian decrees it did during the coronavirus. It wouldn't have done 1/10 of what it did. But they did it because they knew. They knew they could get away with it. And they knew it would increase their power. Governments will constantly push the envelope. It's the nature of government. Our founding fathers all warned about this. And we have thousands of years of recorded history to show this to be true. Now, I can only say that we need people, particularly the younger generation, to advocate for their rights with the same passion demonstrated for TikTok. You know, if we do that, then we can ensure that the misplaced priorities revealed in the debate, that they're addressed. Our constitutional republic remains vibrant and resilient in the face of the evolving challenges and the emerging technologies that exist. If we want to safeguard individual liberties for future generations, we can't be bystanders as our education system collapses. James Madison said that a diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. But we don't have knowledge anymore. And our education system isn't built around this concept of knowledge. Hence the reason people have willingly surrendered their liberties to a government apparatus. It's why so many people fail to use their brains. They fail to think. Look after 9/11. I will constantly repeat this. After 9/11, if you questioned the Patriot Act, if you criticized it, if you raised concerns about it, what did people say? And I'm not talking about just Democrats and lefties. I'm talking about almost the totality of society, including Republicans and conservatives. And they said exactly the same thing. Well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't have to worry. That's hogwash. You always have to worry when you're granting government more and more power, because governments will routinely abuse that power. And it wasn't long afterward that they began abusing the Patriot Act. And look at the beast. Look at the monster that has been created throughout our law enforcement and intelligence apparatus. Look at the systemic abuses that now exist. Headline after headline, week after week. Some new government agency is abusing its power in some sort of way. You now have the CIA interfering in the Biden investigation. It really is remarkable when you look at these abuses. And yet again, we're all distracted. And that's what they want. They want us to be distracted. They want us not to pay attention. Because as they keep on distracting us, they know they'll get away with these abuses. However, the distractions only last so long. sooner or later, we're going to turn around and we're going to regret that we didn't speak up, that we didn't speak out against this massive abuse. Because the clock is ticking. Just look at the $1.2 trillion bill that Congress just passed. That's what I want to take up in the next segment. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back, everyone. So I'm talking about misplaced priorities, and nowhere is this more evident than the out-of-control spending by both political parties in Washington, D.C. It's absurd when you look at the massive $1.2 trillion bill that I haven't even been able to grasp yet. I haven't even been able to go through to pull out all the pork I see. And listen, I understand Republicans, you have to be pragmatic at times. It's an election year. You don't necessarily want a shutdown. But at what point do you gain the courage to say enough's enough? Our debt is rapidly approaching $35 trillion. That equates to over $90,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country. And what's truly frightening is that there's no end in sight. What's even more frightening than that is the fact that people constantly demand more. They want more and more government services. But we are a fiscal train wreck. In 2023, the interest on our national debt, just the interest alone to service the national debt, totaled $659 billion. $659 billion. And in 2024, the Congressional Budget Office expects it to climb to nearly $900 billion. And I will assure you that it will go over that. I could almost guarantee it. But even if we go with the Congressional Budget Office's numbers, this would represent a 32% increase in interest from last year. It follows a 35% and a 39% increase in the two previous years. But don't worry. Remember how President Biden keeps saying he cut the deficit. It's a lie. He didn't do anything. He just keeps spending our money and Congress allows him to. But the lemmings out there, they're going to believe it. They will believe it. That's how disturbed people are in this day and age. And some of you are like, well, why should we care about the national debt? It's a number on a balance sheet, right? Well, no, that's not right. It's wrong. The national debt isn't just some abstract concept. It's a ticking time bomb that threatens to explode. And when it does, there's going to be devastating consequences for all of us. I constantly point to we as Americans and the flaws with the American people, right? Let's just say you have two candidates running for office. You have candidate A and candidate B. Candidate A says, listen, our debt is out of control. We got to be much more responsible. We got to tighten the belt strap. We need to cut spending, the government by at least 20% in every agency and department. And it's going to be difficult. We're all going to have to feel some pain. We're going to have to increase taxes a little bit. But in the end, we're going to get to a balanced budget in a few years. We'll generate surpluses after that, and we'll begin to pay down our national debt. And once our national debt is paid down to sustainable levels, well, then we could flourish, we could grow, we could prosper, and things will be good in the United States. That's candidate A. And then there's candidate B. And candidate B says he hates veterans. He wants to cut 20 to 30% of the veteran budget. Veterans that have sacrificed, made the ultimate sacrifice for this nation. And he doesn't want us to be safe. He wants to cut 20 to 30% from the Department of Defense budget. And so he risks our national security. Do you want to see another 9/11? And then candidate B explains how candidate A hates children. He wants to cut 20 to 30% from our education budget. This is only going to hurt our children, particularly those in the poorest of areas. And he hates old people too, because he doesn't want to see old people getting the services that they need. As candidate B, we need to increase spending. We need to take care of our veterans that sacrifice so much. We need a strong national defense to prevent threats going forward. We need to spend more money on education to compete in the global competitive environment we're in. And if you send me to Washington, I'm going to reduce your taxes because Americans are overburdened already. They can't even live paycheck to paycheck. They're falling behind. Who are you going to vote for? Candidate A that tells you they're going to take everything away, make your life more difficult, but in the end you're going to benefit and will flourish? Or candidate B that says we're going to give you everything now. We may collapse in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. But right now, you're going to feel pretty good because you're going to get all this spending. Who are you voting for? And that's the problem with the American people. Unfortunately, Americans have become short-term thinkers. They don't realize that as the debt continues to grow, so does the burden it places on future generations. And it's not going to be whether or not we make cuts and we could salvage this in 10, 15 years. We either make the cuts now or we're going to have to gut entire programs in 10, 15 years. Our economic growth is going to be stifled in the process. However, we don't think long term. Other nations do. We don't. And that's why some nations are gaining a competitive advantage against us. And let's be honest, the national debt represents a fundamental betrayal of the values that we as Americans are supposed to hold dear, right? It's the national debt that has allowed the massive expansion of our government. It's the spending that has allowed the government to usurp our power and authority. If you cut off the spigots, well, the government begins to contract, and that should be a good thing. Why aren't Republicans introducing any bills to begin cutting these agencies that have abused their power, slash their budgets, or just get rid of them? Why not? Because understand, as we spend more and as government grows, our liberty contracts. This isn't rocket science. All of these principles are put at risk when our government spends beyond its means, and they're mortgaging our future in the process. Yet instead of addressing the root causes of our debt crisis, our leaders, they just ignore it because to them it's about getting reelected. To them it's about power. They're looking at it from the perspective that by the time everything hits the fan, they're not going to be in office. Now, we need to turn the tide now. And for starters, we need to start holding our elected officials accountable for their reckless spending habits. I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. We have to demand fiscal responsibility from both parties. I'm no longer willing to listen to Republicans speak about fiscal responsibility when many of them support these insane spending bills. It's time that we make tough choices. We have to begin to cut the wasteful spending. We have to begin to cut the defense industrial complex. We have to begin to rein in the entitlement that has led so many to become so dependent on the system. So, of course, they're going to grant the system more power. And we have a part to play in addressing the crisis. Just like I said with the whole TikTok debate, we can no longer be bystanders in this. We have to be mindful of what's going on because in the end, the national debt isn't just a problem for politicians to solve. It's a challenge that we as Americans have to confront together. If we want to preserve the country, our founding, our history, our values, all the things that have made this country great, if we want to ensure a future that is filled with optimism and success, then we can no longer afford to ignore the massive problems that we're facing. We have to get involved. We have to speak up. We have to speak out. I don't know what people don't understand about that. When you look at voter turnout numbers, it's absolutely pathetic in this society. Those are the people that we need to reach. Those are the people that we need to speak to. Those are the people that we need to persuade to go to the polls to cast an informed vote for candidates that do understand what public service is about, that do want the United States not only to be strong today, but to be the strongest country going forward, to remain the exceptional nation that we once were. Those are the candidates we need to support. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a good review on any podcast platform that allows it. More importantly, share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. I mean, the reason that the P.A.S. report has grown to the level it's at is through referrals. There's nothing better than word of mouth. It's not advertising. We shoestring budget here, right? We don't make money here. Okay, we make enough to keep this going. That's it. And it keeps going because you, the audience, got the best audience out there, that you share this with other people, you inform them, you talk to them about what's going on. And for that, I am forever grateful. I want to thank you for joining me today. I have a spectacular interview coming out on Monday. You are not going to want to miss it, so make sure that you tune in. Thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.